It was a single, routine announcement from China's Ministry of Commerce, almost invisible. But if you looked closely at the attached file, you'd have noticed something odd. It wasn't a .doc file. It was a .wps file, the format of a domestic Chinese office suite. Normally, who cares?
Right. A total non-event.
Exactly. It's a total non-event. But then, just a day later, the U.S. threatened new export controls on all key American software. Suddenly, that tiny file choice didn't seem so random. The context changed everything.
It exploded across the Chinese internet. The software company's stock skyrocketed. It was immediately held up as a signal, a symbolic declaration that China was ready for a software divorce.
Yeah.
What was interesting, though, was the contrast. This very public, very visible act of defiance, switching a word processor, was concealing a much more fragile and far more critical reality.
Because while Beijing can, at a pinch, live without Microsoft Word, there is another, almost invisible category of American software that China's entire technological ambition depends on. A dependency that Washington is now using as its most powerful weapon.
That small file switch, it's really the perfect visual for this huge structural shift that's happening right now. You know, what we are witnessing is a deliberate, systematic realignment of the entire global tech stack.
A realignment, so not just tinkering around the edges.
Not at all. Beijing is making a very clear political choice here. They're deciding to accept significant short-term pain, real operational friction, and immense cost on its domestic ecosystem.
Okay.
All for the promise of long-term strategic independence. So our mission today really is to analyze this core conflict, that visible political choice versus the invisible, deep technical dependency.
And try to figure out where that line is drawn between what's manageable pain and what's critical.
Precisely. We need to track exactly where that line is. It's really an analysis of the strategic foresight behind China's whole dual circulation strategy and how it's pushing this domestic software adoption for long-term resilience and national security.
Okay, let's unpack this then. We start with that visible signal. The Ministry of Commerce using Kingsoft's WPS format. This was for the rare earth export control document, October 9, 2025.
That's the one.
You mentioned it was read instantly as a signal, but isn't Kingsoft's market share, especially in state-owned enterprises, already pretty dominant? Why did one file from one ministry cause such a massive reaction, like an 18% stock jump? Was the market really that surprised by what seemed like an obvious preference anyway?
That's a really crucial question, right? It gets to the market psychology. Look, the market wasn't surprised by the preference for WPS in government.
Okay.
They were surprised by the perceived mandate and, critically, the timing. This wasn't just any document. It was the announcement of a major retaliatory move, those rare earth export controls.
Yeah.
Big stuff.
Right, hitting back the U.S.
Exactly. And the symbolic defiance was amplified because it happened, like you said, within 24 hours of these credible threats of new U.S. export controls on key software. It basically shifted the whole conversation. It went from this abstract policy goal, we should be self-reliant someday, to a concrete mandated industrial action.
Signaled right from the top.
Right from the top. The stock jump, that just confirmed the market understood. This was the state picking its domestic champion, Kingsoft, and signaling it was ready to use its entire institutional muscle, the whole government apparatus, to force this system-wide tech migration, especially across critical sectors.
So it wasn't just saying we like WPS. It was more like issuing an industrial order under fire, under geopolitical pressure.
Yeah.
Like, okay, people, the trial period is over. Migration is mandatory now.
Precisely. That's exactly how it was read. And, while Kingsoft's WPS is, let's be honest, globally a tiny fraction of the market compared to Microsoft Office, its real strategic value, its importance, lies in its dominance where it counts most for this dual circulation strategy. And that's the state-controlled economy.
Right. The SOEs, the bank.
Exactly. WPS doesn't need to beat Microsoft Word in your average consumer market globally. It needs to secure the domestic fortress. Kingsoft already claims, over 85% coverage in those crucial SOEs?
85%. That's huge domestically.
And contracts with all 5 national commercial banks. So this isn't just about selling software licenses. It's fundamentally about securing critical national digital infrastructure. Yeah. That's the lens to view it through.
That domestic dominance is the key strategic piece then. But, still look at the financials.
Yeah.
That contrast really hammers home the sheer scale of the mountain China has to climb to build a truly competitive global alternative, right?
Absolutely. You have to ground this ambition in the global reality. The disparity, it just highlights this massive infrastructure gap. So Q2 2025, King Thoth's revenue was around, what, 248 million US dollars?
Okay, 248 million.
Now, contrast that with Microsoft's Productivity and Business Processes division. That includes Office, Teams, all that stuff. In the same period, they pulled in a staggering $33.11 billion.
Billion, wow. That's more than 100 times larger.
It's a different universe, and the difference isn't just the software itself, right? It's the entire ecosystem. It's the cloud infrastructure behind it, Azure. It's the integration with hardware partners. It's the global R&D cycles that, frankly, $33 billion can fuel compared to $248 million.
Yeah.
So that switch to WPS, it's an act of immense geopolitical will. It's a massive commitment to future self-sufficiency. But you're right, it is not today anyway, a reflection of global technological parity, not even close in that space.
And this act of will, this WPS signal, doesn't exist in a vacuum. It sits under this much bigger policy umbrella, China's overall economic strategy, the dual circulation strategy. Let's talk about that strategic framework a bit more. How does it drive this push for independence?
Right, DCS. It was introduced by Xi Jinping back in 2020, and it's really the fundamental framework guiding pretty much all economic and tech policy now. At its core, the goals are, well, twofold. First, vertical integration and insulating the domestic market, that's the internal circulation part.
Okay, strengthen the home base.
Exactly. And second, reducing reliance on foreign technology, that's the managed external circulation piece. So for technology, this translates directly into a mandate for self-sufficiency. Because, dependence on foreign software, especially American software, isn't just seen as an economic issue anymore.
It's national security.
It's a profound national security vulnerability. That's the view from Beijing. The whole idea is to create this closed loop eventually where China is self-sufficient for all the critical bits, from the design tools way upstream right down to the end user software like WPS.
And this strategy, this DCS, it gets put into action through something called the Xin Shuang mandate, right? Mm-hmm. That's become the sort of industrial order for self-reliance. Information technology application innovation. Can you break down how that actually works? How is this huge mandate being enforced across the government and state companies?
Yeah, Xin Shuang is the engine driving it. It's the mechanism for this total government-led replacement of foreign IT systems. And for the state sector, you have to understand, this is an industrial command. It's not like, oh, consider buying domestic. It's an order.
Not a suggestion.
Definitely not a suggestion. And the rollout is very systematic. It's moving through critical infrastructure sectors with, honestly, almost military precision. Phase 1, that targeted the core government departments and the party sectors. That was largely done by 2022.
So that was the test bed. See if the domestic stuff actually worked.
Essentially, yes. It was the crucial test run for compatibility, for stability, for figuring out the viability of the domestic products, ironing out the kinks before the big push.
Okay. And then came the really big move, the one people whisper about, the secretive Document 79. What exactly did that 2022 directive demand, and how did it make sure these huge state-owned enterprises actually complied?
Right, Document 79. It came from the highest levels, and it basically mandated that SOEs, state-owned enterprises, in absolutely critical sectors, think finance, energy, telecoms, transport infrastructure.
The crown jewels.
Exactly. They must achieve 100% replacement of foreign hardware, software, and IT systems by the end of 2027.
100%. By 2027, that's ambitious.
Hugely ambitious. This is phase 2, and it represents this colossal system-wide industrial order. Compliance isn't optional. It's measured through rigorous audits, often annually. Companies have to submit replacement reports.
And there are consequences for not hitting the targets.
Oh, absolutely. The incentive, or maybe the pressure, is tied directly to the leadership of these SOEs. Failure to comply with what's framed as a national security mandate. That has serious professional repercussions for the managers running these enterprises. So you can bet it gets prioritized, even over short-term operational cost, or maybe hitting peak efficiency.
So you've got phase 1, core government, done by 2022. Phase 2, critical SOEs, that's the big push now, deadline 2027. And then phase 3 targets the wider market, private companies, consumers.
That's the plan. Phase 3 targets the broader private and consumer market. That will likely follow more organically, maybe with incentives, once the domestic products used in phases 1 and 2 are proven to be stable, mature, and, crucially, compatible with the whole ecosystem.
So it's this forced, rapid evolution rippling outwards, hitting everything from the top policy down to the very foundation, the operating system itself.
Exactly. You can't convincingly divorce your Office suite if you're still running it on Windows everywhere, right? The push goes right down to the OS level. Windows market share in China, while still the biggest chunk, has actively dropped. It was maybe 87% in 2020, down to around 79% by mid-2023.
So domestic alternatives are actually gaining ground.
They are, quite rapidly. Huawei's Harmony OS is a big one, already running on millions of devices, phones, tablets, even some enterprise gear. And then there's Galaxy Kalen, which is specifically tailored and, importantly, certified for government and enterprise use. It's designed to work smoothly with this emerging domestic software stack.
So the whole systematic rollout, it's about building this parallel digital world. Independent, localized, controlled from the ground up.
That's the goal, creating a parallel, independent, localized digital ecosystem, essentially from scratch, securing control over the fundamental data layer, the operating system, the core applications. It's about sovereignty, digital sovereignty.
But that level of top-down change, ripping out globally integrated systems and building this protected domestic fortress, that has to involve immense human friction, right? And cost, even for switching something seemingly simple like an Office suite. Which brings us nicely into Section 2, the actual price of this technological sovereignty. It's not free. Someone pays, often in lost productivity.
Absolutely. And you have to see it from the state's perspective. They're calculating this transition, this friction, as necessary short-term operational pain. It's a cost measured against the benefit of long-term strategic resilience. But yeah, that friction impacts millions of professionals every single day. The accumulated productivity loss, the massive retraining effort needed, the sheer stress involved, that's the immediate tangible cost.
Let's focus on that human friction. You mentioned the story of Zheng Wei, the mid-level finance manager. His experience sounds like it perfectly illustrates this calculated trade-off Beijing is making.
It really does. So imagine Zheng Wei. He's a professional, probably worked his way up, built his career on being efficient, on getting things done accurately. He works for a huge state-owned enterprise, maybe in the finance department, handling complex financial modeling.
Okay.
For years, maybe a decade or more, his entire professional output, think of quarterly budgets, detailed treasury forecasts, complex risk assessments, all of it has been built on Microsoft Excel. He's become a master of it, especially those complex Visual Basic for applications, the VBA scripts, right?
Yeah, the macros. Every big company runs on those.
Exactly. Custom macros that automate his department's entire reporting process, maybe linking data from multiple internal systems, validating it, spitting out reports. This isn't just using Excel. This is his digital expertise, refined over 10 years, embedded in the organization's processes.
And the real killer, like you hinted, is those intricate macros. It's years of accumulated knowledge, often poorly documented, just baked into the code.
That's the nightmare. So the Xin Shuang mandate comes down. The SOE has to switch. They roll out WPS Office. Superficially, his old .xlsx files convert to .wps. Looks okay on the surface.
But underneath,
the engine is different. Kingsoft has its own scripting language, its own way of handling things, those complex VBA macros. They break. They don't just stop working cleanly, they run erratically. Sometimes they calculate things wrong. Sometimes the data validation links just fail silently.
Oh man, so his reliable system is suddenly unreliable.
Totally unreliable. Zhang Wei suddenly loses hours every single day. He's not focusing on financial strategy or risk analysis anymore. He's debugging custom scripts he might have written years ago, trying desperately to translate VBA code he barely remembers into this proprietary Kingsoft scripting language he's never used before.
So his decade of carefully built productivity, his expertise, it's instantly devalued, wiped out almost.
Instantly devalued. This massive, grinding operational inefficiency, the stress, the frustration, the loss of actual productive output, that is the calculated trade-off you mentioned. Beijing seems willing to impose this kind of stress, this friction, on millions of professionals like Zhang Wei. They're accepting this huge operational slowdown today to secure that strategic sovereignty tomorrow.
Wow. Forcing millions of people to essentially scrap a decade of embedded expertise.
Yeah.
That's a phenomenal measure of just how committed they are to this sovereignty goal. But the economic burden, it ripples out further, doesn't it? It must be hitting global companies operating in China really hard too.
Oh, absolutely. That's the other side of the coin. China's push for localization, combined with these prescriptive cybersecurity rules, they've collectively created what's probably the most restrictive data governance environment in any major economy worldwide.
More restrictive than Europe's GDPR.
In many practical ways, yes, especially regarding cross-border data flows and localization mandates. Our research points to at least 29 distinct policies that promote either de facto or forced localization of data, IT infrastructure, sometimes even R&D activities.
29 policies.
Minimum. And for multinational corporations, this translates directly into operational disruption and significant financial strain. Why? Because they can no longer run their efficient, centralized global IT systems the way they used to. They're essentially being forced to build these isolated data islands within China. Legally walled off, sometimes physically walled off too.
And building those isolated islands, it must require huge amounts of duplicated infrastructure and resources, creating this staggering cost overhead.
The numbers are really stark. Estimates we've seen suggest that computing and operational costs within these localized Chinese markets are anywhere from 30% to 60% higher than in more open integrated markets.
30 to 60% higher just to operate in China.
Yes. And the reason is that duplication you mentioned. Companies need entirely separate data centers located within China. Sometimes they have to set up entirely separate R&D hubs just for the China market. And crucially, they need duplicative local staffing, more IT people, more HR, more legal teams required just to manage the separate, walled-off ecosystem that often can't communicate freely or efficiently with the global headquarters.
It sounds like just navigating the legal compliance side must be a massive burden in itself.
It is enormous, and ironically, this push for localization can sometimes undermine the stated goal of security. How? Well, it can impede integrated global risk management.
How so?
Think about it. Data localization often requires critical data to be stored entirely within one single jurisdiction, China. If that jurisdiction experiences a major localized security event, a natural disaster hitting a data center, or maybe a sophisticated, targeted, state-sponsored hacking campaign aimed at China, then that data becomes singularly vulnerable. It arguably reduces system resilience compared to a globally distributed platform where you have backups and redundancies elsewhere.
Right, all your eggs are in one basket, digitally speaking.
Precisely. And furthermore, it creates massive practical obstacles to integrated global risk management. Think about financial services again. It makes it much harder and slower for them to conduct unified global compliance checks, like those crucial anti-money laundering screenings, efficiently across their entire network.
So this cost, this risk, it ultimately gets transferred, doesn't it? It flows down from the state, which mandates the switch for strategic reasons, onto the individual company, the multinational or even the local Chinese firm, just trying to comply and operate.
Exactly. Which brings us to that other story, the one about the Guangzhou factory manager. It perfectly illustrates how these high-level state strategic goals translate into immediate, almost existential risk for individual businesses on the ground.
Right. Tell us about that.
So I read about this manager of a mid-sized manufacturing plant in Guangzhou. Pretty typical operation. He was forced, as part of the Xin Shuang mandate cascading down the supply chain, to switch his logistics platform. He was using a sophisticated U.S. vendor system, probably the industry standard, optimized over years for supply chain efficiency.
Okay.
He had to switch to a less tested domestic alternative. And his big worry wasn't just, oh, the interface is clunky or my staff need retraining. It was the catastrophic risk of outright operational failure.
Because this system runs everything, right? Scheduling, inventory management, just-in-time material deliveries. It's the digital nervous system of the whole factory.
Exactly that. His previous American system, it had probably evolved over maybe 2 decades. It was robust, patched, globally supported, predictable. The new domestic system, while maybe promising on paper, was newer, known to be buggy in its early versions, and lacked the deep integration features and proven reliability of the foreign platform he was used to.
So he realized the risk wasn't theoretical.
Not at all. He realized that the operational risk was being transferred directly from the state, which wanted the strategic benefit of removing foreign dependency onto his individual firm. A single bug in this new mandated logistics software could cause a complete logistical snarl-up, a missed inventory delivery, a critical scheduling failure, anything that could halt his entire assembly line.
Which could put him out of business.
Potentially, yes. Defaulting on contracts, losing customers. The state achieves its strategic goal, kicking out the foreign software, essentially by forcing factory owners like him to abandon proven global standards and personally assume the immediate high-stakes operational risk of running their business on an untested domestic alternative. That's how digital sovereignty gets built on the ground sometimes.
That tension is just palpable, isn't it? Between the visible political progress, look, we switched to WPS, and this hidden real-world cost and risk involved in actually adopting these systems. But now we really have to shift gears. We need to move from the visible world, the world of word processors and logistics platforms, into the truly invisible world, the one dependency that China absolutely cannot just mandate away or easily replace. Section 3, the invisible choke point. This is where switching from Microsoft Word stops being just a challenging mandate and becomes a potentially insurmountable technological blockade.
Yes. This is where we leave the realm of, frankly, manageable, pain-switching office suites, dealing with buggy logistics software and SOEs, and enter the world of critical, almost microscopic dependency, electronic design automation, or EDA software. This is a dependency so deep, so specialized, and so concentrated in foreign hands that it represents the current hard limit of China's technological sovereignty push.
Okay, let's break this down carefully for everyone listening. EDA, electronic design automation. It's the bedrock of making semiconductors, you said. Why is it so absolutely indispensable? Why can't a brilliant engineer just design a complex chip using, I don't know, sophisticated general-purpose software like AutoCAD or something?
That's a great question because it highlights the scale difference. It's like asking why a top architect can't design a modern earthquake-proof skyscraper using only a pencil and some graph paper. You just can't handle the complexity.
Yeah.
EDA is the indispensable suite of software tools that translates an engineer's abstract concept for a microchip, which today might contain billions, even tens of billions of transistors into a physical, manufacturable blueprint. The complexity is just astronomical.
Billions of transistors.
Billions. This software has to simulate how all those microscopic transistors will interact electrically. It has to verify that the complex logic functions embedded in the design will actually work correctly under different conditions, like heat and voltage stress. It has to find and help fix incredibly subtle timing errors that could crash the whole chip. And then it has to convert that validated logical idea into the highly precise geometric files that the chip manufacturer, the foundry, like TSMC or SMIC, needs to actually print the design onto the silicon wafer.
But so without EDA, the whole process just stops.
Yeah.
Before it even begins.
It cannot begin for advanced chips. It is the absolute intellectual infrastructure of the modern semiconductor industry. You cannot design a cutting-edge chip without it, period.
Okay, so EDA is the brain, the software brain, that creates the recipe for the chip long before any of that incredibly expensive manufacturing machinery even gets turned on. And this crucial market, it's not just competitive. You described it as a textbook oligopoly, controlled almost entirely by companies outside of China.
Exactly. This is probably the single starkest technological dependency China faces right now. This absolutely critical market is dominated by just 3 non-Chinese firms. They provide the only full-flow design suites, meaning covering the entire complex process from concept to manufacturing files needed for designing cutting-edge chips.
And those 3 are?
Synopsys and Cadence Design Systems, both US-based. Together, they account for something like 61% of the global market. Then you add in Siemens ED, which is technically German but has very deep US ties and history, originally Mentor Graphics. These 3 firms together control well over 75% of the entire global EDA market.
3/4 of the market, just 3 companies.
And crucially, they hold the accumulated intellectual property, the incredibly complex algorithms, the verified component libraries, all built up over decades and decades of intense R&D and close work with foundries.
Which means China's entire ambition in advanced computing, in AI, in supercomputing, it relies almost completely on getting licenses for software from these 3 Western firms. So how exactly did Washington decide to weaponize this specific software dependency? They seemed quite surgical about it at first.
They've been incredibly targeted, yes, especially initially. They focus not on restricting software for chips being made today, but on the software needed for the future architecture of chips. The first really major move came in August 2022. The U.S. government targeted EDS software specifically used for designing chips that employ the gate-all-around field effect transistor structure, GAFET for short.
GAFET. Okay, we need to pause here for a second. For you listening, why is GAFET such a critical technology leap, especially for these chips smaller than 5 nanometers? And why is restricting the software to design them the ultimate choke point?
Right. Let's break down GAFET simply. Think of transistors as the tiny on-off switches that make up a chip. Older chips use planar transistors, kind of like single-story homes, where the electrical current flowed flat along the surface. Then came FinFET, which is the dominant technology today for advanced chips. That was like building high-rise apartments for the electrons, the fine structure stuck up, giving the gate more control over the current flow from 3 sides. Better control, less leakage.
Right, like 3D transistors.
Exactly. GAFET is the necessary next big 3D leap beyond FinFET. Instead of a fin, it often uses tiny horizontal nanowires or nanosheets for the channel where the current flows. And crucially, the gate material, which controls the on-off switching, is wrapped all around the channel on all four sides. Gate all around.
Why wrap it completely around? What's the benefit?
As you shrink transistors down to the 3 nanometer node and then 2 nanometers and below, you face enormous physics challenges. Primarily stopping electrons from leaking out when the switch is supposed to be off and managing power consumption. GAFET's structure, wrapping the gate fully around the channel, allows for much tighter electrostatic control over that flow of current.
Better control means less leakage, more efficiency.
Precisely. It's considered essential for achieving the required power efficiency and performance density needed for the next generation of everything. AI accelerators, powerful supercomputers, advanced cloud data center chips. So by restricting these specialized ED software tools needed to design the complex GAFET structure, the U.S. didn't restrict a physical machine or a material. They restricted the very knowledge, the simulation capability, the ability to even create the blueprints for the next generation of cutting-edge chip designs.
It's like banning the advanced architectural software needed for skyscrapers, not the cranes or the steel.
That's a great analogy. It imposes a technological brick wall purely through software controls. It chokes innovation right at the design source long before manufacturing.
And then more recently, in 2025, we saw the restrictions escalate, moving beyond just GAFET-specific tools to much broader sales restrictions on ED.
Yes, that was a major escalation. In May 2025, the U.S. Commerce Department issued new notices. These broadly prohibited all sales and shipments of EDA software to Chinese entities, unless the vendor could obtain an extremely difficult-to-get export license.
All EDA software, that's sweeping.
Incredibly sweeping. It forced vendors like Synopsys, for whom China represents a significant chunk of sales, maybe around 16% at the time, to basically suspend sales overnight and pull their financial forecasts almost instantly. It just demonstrates the immense power of this particular software choke point, the ability to effectively freeze the advanced R&D cycle of an entire nation's tech industry with a single regulatory notice.
This really sounds like a nearly insurmountable hurdle for Beijing to clear quickly. Why is this EDA oligopoly Synopsys, Cadence, Siemens so incredibly entrenched? Why can't China, with its huge pool of engineers and massive state investment pouring into tech, simply build its own equivalent EDA software?
It's a fantastic question, and the answer lies in a combination of factors. It's a systemic challenge built on, I'd say, 3 core mutually reinforcing dependencies. And state money, while essential, can really only solve one part of that equation directly.
Okay, let's break down those 3 dependencies. What's the first one? You mentioned the R&D scale.
Right. The sheer colossal scale of R&D required. EDA firms are unique in the tech world. They consistently reinvest over 35% of their revenue back into R&D. That's among the highest margins in the entire semiconductor industry value chain.
35% just plowed back into research.
Year after year after year. And it's not just continuous investment, it's anticipatory investment. They have to hire teams of PhDs, physicists, computer scientists, applied mathematicians to develop software tools that can accurately model the incredibly complex physics of a semiconductor manufacturing process that maybe hasn't even been fully perfected yet by the foundries.
They're designing tools for factories that barely exist.
Exactly. Chinese startups, even with state backing, simply cannot yet match that scale of continuous multi-decade investment needed to keep pace with the bleeding edge of physics, new materials science, and highly complex new design methodologies like GAFET. The accumulated knowledge base is immense.
Okay, so that's the sheer money and the depth of the intellectual property library. What's the second factor? You said there's a more technical lock-in that prevents easy domestic substitution.
Yes, and this one might be even harder to overcome. It's the ecosystem cohesion, specifically centered around something called proprietary process development kits, or PDKs.
PDKs, what are those exactly?
This is the absolute linchpin connecting design to manufacturing. EDA tools, the software, must work intimately, hand in glove, with the chip manufacturers, the foundries like TSMC or Samsung or Intel. They communicate through these PDKs. A PDK is essentially the foundry's secret recipe book for a specific manufacturing process, like TSMC's 3 nanometer process.
Secret recipe. What's in it?
It contains all the specific, highly proprietary design rules and electrical parameters for that node. Things like the exact manufacturing tolerances, the electrical characteristics of the transistors they can build, the specific material science constraints, the minimum spacing between wires, thousands of details.
Okay, so it's the instruction manual for how to design something that their specific factory can actually build reliably.
Precisely. Now here's the lock-in. If a domestic Chinese EDA company manages to build a technically brilliant software tool, but they cannot get access to, say, TSMC's or Samsung's most advanced PDKs, maybe because of geopolitical issues, lack of trust, or U.S. export controls on the PDKs themselves, then their fantastic domestic EDA software is completely useless for designing cutting-edge chips destined for those foundries.
Because the software doesn't know the rules of the factory it needs to talk to.
Exactly right. You cannot reliably reverse engineer a PDK because it's not static. It's a living document, constantly updated by the foundry as they refine their process. The advanced EDA tools must be certified and verified by the foundry using the PDK to ensure that a chip designed on that software can actually be manufactured successfully with good yields. That access to the latest advanced PDKs requires years, often decades, of deep reciprocal trust and incredibly tight technical collaboration between the EDA vendor and the foundry.
So it's a multi-layered barrier, technical, relational, trust-based.
And geopolitical. It creates this incredibly strong, almost unbreakable barrier to entry for newcomers trying to design for the most advanced nodes.
Okay, that makes sense. R&D scale, PDK access.
What's a third factor? You mentioned the human element engineer, switching costs. Even if Chinese tools got really good, say 90% as capable, getting the actual chip designers to switch sounds like a huge challenge.
It is intensely difficult. Think about the engineers themselves. Highly specialized chip designers. These are people who have invested years, maybe their entire careers, in mastering the intricacies of the existing platforms. Synopsys, Cadence, maybe Siemens EDA.
They know all the shortcuts, the workarounds.
Exactly. They know the hundreds of complex verification steps required for a modern chip. They know the common bugs and how to avoid them. They have specific optimized workflows built up over years that make them incredibly productive on those specific tools. Asking them to switch to a new, unproven domestic platform, even if it looks good on paper, that forces a massive, time-consuming, and very costly retraining effort. And it introduces risk into their projects.
Huge risk, especially for multi-million-dollar cutting-edge chip designs where one subtle error can mean failure. It fundamentally limits their ability to innovate quickly and efficiently. For the most talented and experienced engineers, the current EDA toolset isn't just software, it's an extension of their own expertise. Switching feels like asking a concert violinist to suddenly play a new, slightly different instrument right before a major performance. It's deeply disruptive.
Let's bring this down to the individual level again. You mentioned Lin, the AI chip engineer in Shenzhen.
Yeah.
How does this EDA dependency actively throttle her productivity, her ambition, especially when she's trying to push the boundaries in AI chip design?
Lin's situation is representative of many top engineers in China right now. She's brilliant, working at maybe a cutting-edge AI startup, designing specialized chips, perhaps neural network accelerators. But she operates under this constant cloud of fear, this background anxiety that her American EDA licenses could be terminated instantly by a new U.S. regulation.
Which would just stop her project dead in its tracks.
Completely halt months, maybe years of work, multi-million-dollar projects potentially down the drain overnight. So, to mitigate that risk, her company pushes her to test the domestic EDA tools that are emerging. But when she does, she finds them, well, inadequate. Especially for the really complex parts of the design process, like advanced simulation and verification for these ultra-complex AI chips.
She used that great analogy, like trying to build an intricate Swiss watch with dull knives.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate a bit? What do those dull knives actually represent in terms of missing features or bugs?
That analogy is just perfect, isn't it? It means the domestic tools are often still buggy, which is frustrating, but maybe fixable over time. More critically, though, they often lack the really advanced simulation and analysis features needed to model the complex physics at these tiny nanometer scales accurately.
Like what specifically?
Well, they might lack robust, validated tools for power integrity analysis, or for closing timing paths correctly on incredibly fast chips. Or maybe they failed to accurately model complex signal integrity issues, how electrical signals degrade at the very high frequencies these AI chips run at. For a 5-nanometer AI chip with billions of transistors, you need to verify billions upon billions of interactions with incredible precision.
So if the tools aren't precise enough,
if the tools aren't precise enough or lack certain verification capabilities, Lin's team ends up spending an immense amount of time writing manual workarounds, developing custom scripts, doing extra manual checks, just to compensate for the missing features or the lack of trust in the tool's results. So instead of spending, say, 90% of her time pushing the boundaries of AI algorithm design and chip architecture, she might be spending 50% of her time just fighting her own design tools.
That's a massive drag on innovation.
It actively throttles the productivity and the ambition of China's best and brightest engineers. It constrains innovation precisely where Beijing needs it most right now, at the absolute cutting edge of AI and advanced computing. It's a profound strategic restraint imposed by this software dependency.
Okay, that is a huge constraint. But that intense pressure, that throttling you describe, it must be creating some kind of reaction, right? Some accelerated counter strategy within China's tech sector. It almost forces a certain Darwinian efficiency, doesn't it? Which brings us to Section 4, how China is adapting and the progress they are making.
Indeed it does. Restrictions, especially severe ones like these EDA controls, while incredibly painful in the short term, can absolutely force efficiency and spur unexpected innovation pathways. It's that old saying, necessity is the mother of invention.
Right. NVIDIA's CEO, Jensen Huang, even mentioned something along those lines, didn't he?
Yeah.
About how cutting off Chinese competitors like Huawei from the easy path, just buying the best foreign hardware, might actually force them to innovate faster indigenously.
He did suggest that, yeah. The idea being that it forces them to become much more efficient, much more clever with the resources they do have access to. It might strengthen them in the long run, at least within their protected domestic market. By forcing rapid, sometimes unconventional innovation, they simply have to achieve more with less.
Necessity accelerating invention. So where are we seeing this forced efficiency most clearly right now? It sounds like the AI race is a key area where they're trying to use ingenuity to bypass some of these hardware constraints imposed by the U.S.
Absolutely. The constrained access to the absolute top-tier U.S. hardware, particularly the most advanced GPUs from NVIDIA, has definitely driven a kind of revolution in algorithmic efficiency in China's AI sector. They are finding really clever ways to achieve dramatic performance gains using less raw brute force computing power than might be typical in the West.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. Look at DeepSeek AI. They're a major domestic AI player in China. They made headlines when they claimed they managed to train their large language model, V3, for only about $5.6 million US dollars.
Okay, 5.6 million. How does that compare?
Well, compare that to the estimated training costs for models like OpenAI's GPT-4, which are thought to be closer to $100 million, maybe even more.
Wow, that's more than an order of magnitude difference in training cost. How on earth are they achieving that kind of cost reduction and efficiency gain, especially if they don't have unlimited access to the absolute best, most powerful hardware?
Primarily, it seems, through algorithmic cleverness. Specifically, they're making heavy use of a technique called sparsity.
Sparsity. Okay, what's that?
Think of a massive neural network, like a huge, complex city road network. A traditional dense network tries to train and keep every single road active and important simultaneously. That requires enormous computing power and energy.
Right, lots of traffic everywhere.
Exactly. Sparsity, on the other hand, involves strategically pruning or cutting away the less important connections, the less critical side roads in the network, often during the training process itself. By substituting these advanced algorithms for sheer brute force computing power, they're essentially training the network to be highly specialized and hyper-efficient, ensuring only the most essential computational routes are heavily used.
So it uses less power, less computation to get a similar result.
That's the idea. It dramatically reduces the need for raw computational power and energy, which directly helps compensate for the scarcity or lower performance of the hardware they might be using compared to the absolute top-of-the-line imported chips.
And we're seeing the big Chinese tech players like Baidu really embrace this idea, integrating the need for efficiency into a fully self-reliant vertical stack to maximize optimization.
Baidu is a prime example of this Xin Shuang philosophy being applied directly to the AI domain. They are deeply committed to vertical integration. They've built out this massive computing cluster using, I think the number is around 30,000 of their own self-developed AI chips, the third-generation Kunlun P800 chips.
30,000 of their own chips.
Yeah, and their whole strategy is about maximizing efficiency by tightly integrating the chip design itself, the software stack running on top of it, like their open source Paddle deep learning framework, and the AI models they develop, like their Ernie chatbot. By controlling the entire stack, from silicon to model.
They can tune everything to work together perfectly.
Exactly. They can customize every single layer for maximum performance and energy efficiency within their own self-developed ecosystem. This helps insulate them almost completely from external constraints, whether it's on hardware availability or specific foreign software layers. It's self-reliance in action.
Okay, so progress on the AI efficiency front is clear. But let's circle back to that hardest nut to crack, the EDA software itself. Have we seen any tangible progress in domestic Chinese EDA alternatives beyond just acknowledging the huge simulation gap at the cutting edge?
Yes, we have definitely seen significant progress, especially at the foundational level. It's important not to dismiss that. For instance, in October 2025, there was a notable step forward. A company called Quanfeng, which I believe is a subsidiary of Securier, launched a new suite of domestic EDA tools.
Okay, Quanfeng Securier. What did their tools focus on?
Crucially, these initial tools focused on areas like schematic capture, basically drawing the circuit diagrams and printed circuit board, or PCB design. These are really foundational, more back-end focused tools used for laying out the physical design and connections on the actual circuit board that the chips sit on.
So not the super complex chip design itself, but the board layout. Still important, though.
Very important and a necessary step. And the performance claims for these foundational tools were actually quite substantial.
What did they claim?
They claimed their new suite could exceed certain established industry benchmarks by up to 30% and potentially reduce hardware development cycles, meaning the time to design the PCB, by as much as 40%. And apparently they saw pretty rapid adoption, with reports of over 20,000 engineers starting to use them.
20,000 engineers. So there's demand for reliable domestic options.
Absolutely, especially for this kind of non-cutting edge but still crucial foundational work. This progress is significant because it provides a capable, homegrown option for essential tasks, and importantly, it's designed to be fully compatible with the local domestic OS stack, like Galaxy Kalen. So it strengthens that overall digital fortress they're trying to build.
You mentioned the crucial gap remains. That gap for the really complex front-end design tools, the ones needed for designing those 3-nanometer GAFET chips, for example.
Yes, that gap absolutely persists, and by all accounts, it is still vast. While Quanfeng's progress on foundational tools is real and commendable, it doesn't yet solve the core problem upstream. It doesn't solve the challenge of logic design, complex simulation, and rigorous verification needed at the absolute cutting edge of silicon design.
The stuff needed for GAFET and beyond.
Exactly. Those tools require modeling physics at an almost atomic level, and crucially, they need to be validated against those proprietary foundry PDKs we talked about earlier. Most experts who track this closely estimate that closing that comprehensive technical and ecosystem gap,
which includes not just the software code, but the huge IP libraries, the decades of accumulated trust with foundries.
All of that. Closing that entire gap could realistically still take anywhere from 5 to 10 years, maybe longer. The dependency at the bleeding edge remains fragile and very acute.
This intense pressure trying to close that gap, it must really highlight the reality for that young engineer you mentioned earlier, the one tasked with leading this progress, that young Shenzhen engineer feeling pressure to both replicate existing functions and innovate beyond them simultaneously. That sounds like a fascinating, almost impossible contradiction.
It really captures the dilemma. I read about a young software engineer working probably incredibly long hours in Shenzhen. On one hand, she feels this immense motivation, right? She's building critical infrastructure for national security, helping secure the nation's digital fortress. That's a powerful driver.
Yeah, sense of mission.
Definitely. But on the other hand, she feels this almost impossible pressure. The state, her managers, they're asking her team to essentially replicate the basic functions, the stability, the user interface details, the reliability that global software giants like Synopsys or Cadence already perfected maybe 15 years ago. Get the basics right first.
But at the same time,
they desperately need her team to innovate beyond those Western giants to close the current technical gap at the cutting edge. It's this dual mandate: catch up on decades of development and leapfrog the current leaders all at once.
Well, it sounds exhausting.
It must be. Companies like Kingsoft and Office Software and Quanfeng and EDA, they are essentially tasked by the state with securing this critical national digital infrastructure. And that forces this incredibly rapid, often painful, and sometimes contradictory evolutionary process. This intense human effort, this pressure cooker environment, is how they're trying to build that foundational digital safety net at an incredible pace.
And to support this whole forced evolution, the state must be pouring money into the human capital side too, right? making sure they have enough skilled people, enough engineers and scientists to actually execute these complex replacements and innovations.
Oh, absolutely. China clearly recognizes that technological sovereignty isn't just about code or machines. It's ultimately driven by people. So they are investing massively in talent development across the board.
Like STEM education.
Yeah. Huge investments in STEM education, from schools right up through universities, aiming to grow the pipeline and close any workforce quality gap with the US and Europe in key areas. But beyond just education, they're also actively working to bring talent back and keep it there. Programs like the 1,000 Talents Plan are being renewed or adapted.
Trying to reverse the brain drain.
Exactly. Offering really competitive financial incentives, sometimes housing benefits, significant research funding, and importantly, leadership opportunities to attract overseas Chinese scientists and engineers back home. They recognize the acute need for that high-value techno-scientific expertise, as one report put it, not just to design these new domestic systems, but to manage them, operate them, and ultimately use them effectively to drive innovation.
So the political choice for independence is being enforced structurally through things like Document 79 and the SOE mandates, but also legally through this dense thicket of regulations around data and cybersecurity that impose severe operational friction on companies. That brings us neatly to our final section. The legal reality of data localization and the global bifurcation this whole situation is forcing.
Right. The regulatory environment, it's not just policy, it's the actual legal mechanism that enforces this decoupling in practice. It creates this fundamentally bifurcated legal reality that every single global company operating in China now has to navigate.
Right.
And this is built primarily on that tripartite legal foundation you hear about.
Let me guess. The cybersecurity law, the data security law, and the personal information protection law.
I've got it. The CSL from 2017, the DSL from 2021, and PIPL, also from 2021. Together, they form the core.
And these laws, combined, they create an environment that, as we heard, U.S. companies often describe as the world's most restrictive on data flows, especially when combined with those 29 or more specific localization policies you mentioned earlier. What's the single biggest operational headache these laws cause for businesses on the ground?
Honestly, it's the paralyzing ambiguity, particularly around the definition of important data.
Important data, that sounds important, but vague.
Exactly. The definition remains frustratingly unclear and can vary significantly across different industry sectors and even different local regulators. This lack of clarity leads to massive paralysis for companies because they simply don't know for sure what data they can transfer across borders, what needs special security assessments, and what absolutely must stay within China.
And that ambiguity becomes a tool in itself.
It can, yes. It allows for inconsistent enforcement. We've seen instances where a large volume of seemingly ordinary customer information, maybe a database with over 1 million customer records, not obviously state secrets, can be somewhat arbitrarily classified as nationally sensitive or important data by a local regulator during an inspection.
And that classification triggers a whole cascade of requirements.
Immediately. It triggers mandatory, often costly security reviews. It triggers strict data localization requirements, meaning that data has to be stored physically within China. And it often comes with expensive local audit requirements.
So the lack of clear rules, rather than just the strictness of the rules themselves, becomes the weapon, because global compliance becomes almost impossible to guarantee proactively.
Precisely. Global businesses thrive on clear, predictable rules. But here, you have a situation where even voluntary national standards are frequently enforced as if they were mandatory regulations. You have compliance deadlines, sometimes just 15 days, to rectify complex cross-border data flow offenses that are often completely unworkable for large global businesses, with legal and IT teams spanning multiple time zones and relying on centralized global infrastructure.
So what's the result for the multinationals?
The result is they often have to hire specialized, expensive, local legal counsel just to constantly debate the definition of their own data with regulators. It severely hinders proactive compliance planning and just dramatically raises the operational overhead and legal risk of doing business.
Let's look at how this plays out in specific, highly regulated industries. You mentioned financial services earlier. How does data localization actually damage global compliance structures, like those critical anti-money laundering checks?
Right. The financial sector has faced some form of localization pressure since way back in 2009, even before the CSL. Current regulations explicitly bar or severely restrict the cross-border transfer of key customer data, things like customer identification details and transaction information.
And why is that a problem for global AML systems?
Because those sophisticated anti-money laundering, AML, and counterterrorism financing, CTF systems rely heavily on being able to analyze transaction patterns and potential anomalies across a bank's entire global network. They need to see the big picture to spot sophisticated money laundering rings or terrorist financing networks that operate across borders.
But if the China data is legally walled off,
if the China transaction data is legally siloed and cannot be easily integrated into the central global analysis engine in real time, it fundamentally weakens the effectiveness of that global compliance system. It creates blind spots. So banks operating in China are forced to hire duplicative local compliance teams, who often have less visibility and potentially less effective tools, leading to increased compliance risk not just in China, but globally.
Okay, let's switch to the automotive sector. Data is obviously the fuel for all these new advanced driver assistance features, autonomous driving ambitions. How does the broad definition of important data impact foreign automakers trying to sell their most advanced vehicles in China?
The definitions of important data in the automotive sector regulations are incredibly sweeping. They seem to restrict almost any potentially useful sensor data generated by the car from easily leaving China.
Like what kind of data?
It encompasses detailed GPS and mapping data. It includes data on traffic flow volumes, especially in areas deemed sensitive, even data from electric vehicle charging stations. And critically, it includes a lot of the exterior sensor data, like high-resolution images of license plates or pedestrians' faces captured by the car's cameras and sensors. All of this can be classified as nationally sensitive, important data.
So what does that mean for the car features?
It forces foreign automakers to fundamentally redesign or disable many of their advanced driver assistance systems, ADAS features for the China market, especially those features that rely on constant real-time data feedback loops to global R&D pipelines for training and improvement.
They can't learn from the Chinese driving environment easily.
Not easily on a global scale, no. The result is they end up having to create a bespoke, China-specific software version of the car's operating system and features. And that version inevitably lags behind global updates, performance improvements, and new feature rollouts. Over time, it risks making the foreign brand's product less competitive within the Chinese market itself compared to domestic players who might face fewer restrictions.
And healthcare, particularly thinking about global clinical trials for new drugs or treatments. That must be critically affected by these data walls, especially given the sensitivity around genetic information.
Absolutely. Healthcare faces its own separate complex set of rules. Any cross-border transfer of what's defined as human genetic resource data requires specific, often lengthy government approval processes.
Even for routine reporting.
Yes, that's the key challenge. This applies even for routine, necessary reporting, such as a foreign pharmaceutical company needing to submit adverse event reports from a clinical trial site in China back to its global safety database, or to foreign regulators like the US FDA or the European Medicines Agency. That reporting is normally a mandatory part of ensuring drug safety globally.
So it slows everything down.
It significantly limits the ability of foreign companies to conduct efficient, globally integrated clinical trials that include Chinese patients. It forces them often to find local partners, duplicate data analysis efforts within China, and generally slows down the process of bringing innovative new diagnostics or pharmaceutical products, which rely on sharing and analyzing trial data globally for verification and approval to patients both inside and outside of China.
So faced with this legal minefield, this operational fragmentation, this constant compliance headache, it becomes much clearer why so many multinational companies are, perhaps reluctantly, shifting towards this in China, for China operational model you hear about.
They really feel they have little choice. They are increasingly accepting operational isolation as perhaps the only truly compliant path forward in this environment. And that means consciously disconnecting their local Chinese teams, products, and sometimes even R&D pipelines from their centralized global IT systems, data flows, and support structures.
It ensures compliance with the CSL, DSL, PIPL.
It helps ensure compliance, yes. But the practical trade-off is stark, and companies know it. The products and services they offer locally under this model risk becoming functionally less competitive over time. Why? Because they're effectively cut off from that continuous fire hose, as one executive called it, of global R&D advancements, security updates, feature enhancements, and centralized expert support systems. They become these bespoke, localized maintenance burdens that are inevitably slower to adapt and often more expensive to run in the long term.
But it's not all retreat and isolation, is it? Some companies, you mentioned GlobalFoundries as an example, seem to be actively pursuing a more nuanced, bifurcated strategy that explicitly accepts this new reality.
Correct. GlobalFoundries is a good example of a more proactive, strategic adaptation, one that explicitly acknowledges this bifurcated world we're heading towards. Their approach involves partnering locally within China, often through joint ventures, specifically to produce mature node semiconductor chips.
So not the absolute cutting-edge stuff.
Right. The workhorse chips. The chips used widely in automotive applications, consumer electronics, certain industrial controls areas where the technology is less sensitive, and the geopolitical risk of forced tech transfer might be perceived as lower. Simultaneously, they maintain strict, centralized global control over their most advanced intellectual property, their crown jewel process technologies, and their cutting-edge R&D activities, keeping all of that securely outside of China.
So they're accessing the huge Chinese market for the less sensitive tech, while carefully walling off their most valuable IP from geopolitical mandates and localization pressures.
Exactly. It's a strategy that tries to get the best of both worlds in this fragmenting landscape. Participate in the volume market within China where possible, but protect the core competitive advantage globally.
Okay. So as we wrap up this deep dive, it really feels like we're left with these two parallel realities defining the global tech landscape now. They're operating simultaneously, but often they're not really communicating with each other effectively.
Yes, that's a perfect way to summarize it. On one hand, you have China's successful, state-backed, politically driven push to create this resilient domestic digital ecosystem. We see it in the visible switch to WPS, the systematic rollout of the Xin Shuang mandates through SOEs, the impressive progress in areas like high-efficiency AI with companies like DeepSeek finding clever workarounds. It shows a real determined political effort to build a resilient, if arguably more costly and sometimes less efficient, fortress economy digitally.
That's the visible success story, driven by political will.
Right. But then on the other hand, operating almost invisibly beneath that surface, there remains that ongoing, incredibly fragile dependency on the microscopic level of advanced design software, the EDA tools, a dependency that Washington has clearly identified and skillfully weaponized to throttle Chinese innovation precisely at the cutting edge, where it matters most for future competitiveness. This creates two fundamentally distinct speeds of technological development now.
And the long-term stakes of this contest, this bifurcation, they feel immense. We're not just talking about trade anymore.
No, they are absolutely immense. This conflict has permanently moved way beyond just tariffs or negotiating market access for soybeans or cars. What we're witnessing is the actual rewriting of the foundational design rules, the operating principles for the next era of computing and technology.
And the result?
The result seems increasingly likely to be a permanently bifurcated world, a world where technological progress itself becomes increasingly defined and perhaps constrained by geopolitical boundaries. We're seeing the emergence of two separate, increasingly expensive, and often non-communicating technological supply chains and ecosystems. The fundamental choice being forced upon nations and companies today is between prioritizing global efficiency and integration versus prioritizing national sovereignty and resilience. And right now, it looks like the world is reluctantly choosing to pursue both, essentially building two systems that potentially double the cost and complexity